Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This just happens to be a little blue book. It is Little Blue Book number 409, and it is entitled Great Men of Science, written by Hereward Carrington, PhD, and it is copyrighted 1924. So this is Great Men of Science, circa 1924. And we left off on top of page 38. This is part 4 of Great Men of Science. And here we go. It was Huxley's famous essay on the physical basis of life that first drew public attention to the importance of protoplasm as the possible source of life phenomena. Huxley also accomplished an enormous amount of work in the fields of morphology and paleontology. 3 of its famous works are contained in the present series of Little Blue Books, viz. Aphorisms, number 228, A Liberal Education, number 7, and Reflections on Modern Science, number 238. Ernest Heckl of Jenna was born in 1834 and died only recently. He was one of the early champions of evolution in Germany and has had a far-reaching influence upon the general public through his semi-popular works such as The Riddle of the Universe and The Wonders of Life. He followed up these books by others such as The Last Link and Freedom in Science and Teaching, in which he attacked religious intolerance. His little-known book, A Visit to Ceylon, is full of interest from various points of view. Of his more strictly scientific work, his Evolution of Man, in 2 volumes, and his General Morphology are classical. One of his series of lectures, 3 lectures on evolution, is published as number 49 in the present series. Heckl, like Huxley, was a born fighter and was engaged in controversy all of his life. Theodore Schwann, 1810 to 1882, was one of the joint founders of the modern cell theory, together with Sheldon, 1804 to 1881. Their names are usually classed together, but Schwann was the greater scientist. His work upon the structure and growth of plants and animals is one of the great classics of biology. Schleiden was more specifically a botanist, occupying the chair of botany for more than 20 years in the University of Genoa. University of Jenna, G-E-N-A. J-E-N-A. As the result of his work, Max Schulze advanced in 1861 his Protoplasm Doctrine. In beginning, in effect, that plants and animals alike share a living substance consisting of a mass of protoplasm surrounding a nucleus. Verworn continued these researches, and E.B. Wilson in America has published a classical work upon the cell in development and inheritance, in which he summarized all the available knowledge upon the subject to date. Protoplasm, which Huxley had termed the physical basis of life, was investigated in great detail by Felix Dujardin and first described by him in 1835. He is generally regarded as the discoverer of protoplasm. Pruninge, P-R-U-K-I-N-J-E, Pruninge, 1787 to 1869, was another early investigator of the nature of protoplasm. And after him, the Purkinje cell in the brain are named. Remember that in biology class. Carl Naegeli, 1817 to 1891, while primarily a botanist, added several important contributions to biology. The same may be said of Hugo von Mohl, Ferdinand Cohen, and others. Lorenzo Spallanzani. Lorenzo Spallanzani, 1729 to 1799, was one of the most eminent men of his time. He showed that the experiments which he had conducted by Needham on the spontaneous generation of life was inconclusive, just as Pasteur and Tyndall showed many years later. Sherrington is noted for his famous work on the integrative action of the nervous system, a classical book. Dr. Jacques Loeb, for many years connected with the Rockefeller Institute in New York, is noted for his studies in artificial fertilization and for his views upon the mechanistic conception of life. His books, The Dynamics of Living Matter, The Organism as a Whole, Artificial Parthenogenesis, The Psychology of the Brain, The Mechanistic Conception of Life, etc., are well known. Holding very contrary views, Professor Hans Dreisch, Dreisch, has published several important works upholding the vitalistic doctrine. The most important of these are The Science and Philosophy of the Organism, in 2 volumes, and The History and Theory of Vitalism. Menschenkopf, for many years director of the Pasteur Institute in Paris, has published several important works such as The Nature of Man, The Prolongation of Life, etc. Jennings has contributed many very important works upon the psychic life of microorganisms, such as The Behavior of the Lower Organisms and Life and Death in Unicellular Organisms. G. N. Calkins, P. Enriquez, Pearl, Wallegren, and others have also contributed work of great value in this field. Dr. Walter B. Cannon of Harvard has published an important work entitled Bodily Changes in Pain, Hunger, Fear, and Rage, in which the physic influences of these passions and emotions are shown. Dr. Kramer of Austria has recently published some very important findings which seem to prove the inheritance of acquired characteristics. In some quarters, he is considered the most original and promising biologist since Huxley and Darwin. He has lately published a book upon rejuvenation, largely detailing the work of Dr. Steinig. Steinig and Dr. Voronoff of Paris have both experimented extensively upon the transplantation of glands. Voronoff's research have been published in his book on life. Professor E. D. Cope is considered one of the greatest comparative anatomists America has produced. He extended his investigations not only to living forms but also to fossil life. His premature death was a great loss to American science. August Weismann was born in 1834 and was the first to defend in detail the theory of germinal continuity, which has since become a cornerstone in modern biology. In answer to the puzzling question, why do children resemble their parents, Weismann answered, because they are made of the same stuff. A stream of living matter is continuously passed on from generation to generation in unbroken continuity, and it is this which forms the physical basis of heredity. Weismann's ideas at first met with great opposition, but have become more and more widely accepted. His theories have thrown a flood of light upon the basis of heredity, and tended to color all modern thought, replacing the older views common in Darwin's day. For instance, his name will always be remembered because of this fundamental contribution of his to the theory of heredity. Gregor Mendel, 1822 to 1884, was an Austrian monk whose experiments have greatly influenced modern biology. Since they have shown us the laws governing heredity to a great extent, he lived on obscure life, carrying on a number of experiments in his own garden on crossbreeding peas, flowers, etc., and noting the results. The Mendelian theory of heredity has now become an accepted part of all modern views of heredity. His work remained practically unnoticed during his lifetime and was only brought into public prominence in 1900, when the law was practically rediscovered. His work, however, is now accorded high rank. Francis Galton, born in 1822, was the grandson of Erasmus Darwin and the cousin of Charles. He undertook the experimental study of the laws of heredity, many of which he embodied in his book on natural inheritance, published in 1889. He undertook to determine the proportion of heritage that is, in the average, contributed by each parent, grandparent, etc., and arrived at the following conclusions. The parents together contribute 1/2 the total heritage, the 4 grandparents together 1/4, the 8 great-grandparents 1/16, and all the remainder of the ancestry together 1/16. Galton's work, while not strictly along biological lines, has had great influence upon biology because of his influence upon theories as to heredity. Professor C.B. Davenport of Cold Springs Harbor, New York, is at present engaged in experimental work along the lines of general heredity and its practical application to the science of eugenics. I wondered when I'd come across eugenics being mentioned in a 1920s publication. Professor Charles S. Minot of Harvard was also a noted American biologist who made a number of valuable contributions to the subject of growth, death, and heredity. A summary of his views is contained in his book Age, Growth, and Death. Professors Child, Conklin, Ritter, and Pearl are also noted contemporary American biologists. Professor Charles Rickett is perhaps the most noted physiologist in France. C. Lloyd Morgan has published a number of important works dealing with the evolution of mind, the instincts, etc., in animals. Among those we may mention Habit and Instinct, Extinct and Experience, etc. McCabe has also written a useful book upon the evolution of mind. The writings of Fabre, Lovelock, etc. should also be mentioned, dealing as they do with the life of bees and wasps, etc. Hugo de Vries, Vries, director of Botanical Garden in Amsterdam, is a botanist of international repute. His mutation theory has greatly influenced our views as to heredity, and also the question of the origin of species. He proved that it is quite possible for species to change suddenly by jumps instead of through ages of slow transformation. These sudden changes he demonstrated and called mutations. Turning page. Okay, mutations. Come on. I know there's another page there. Nope. Mutations, and his views have had a far-reaching effect upon modern biology. Luther Burbank has practically applied the idea of such transformations and thus succeeded in producing and placing upon the market many new varieties of fruits, vegetables, flowers, etc. New chapter. Evolutionists. And I think I'll take a sip of coffee before we get this started. So nice. Okay, new chapter. Evolutionists. The name of Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, will probably occupy the foremost place for all time to come in the history of evolution. He was the grandson of the famous Ernest Darwin and gained his first wide experience of nature in his voyage around the world in the Beagle. Much has been written concerning the life and personality of Darwin, as well as his scientific work and attainments. He worked out the theories of natural selection and sexual selection, proposed the theory of pangenesis to account for heredity, and placed the doctrine of evolution upon a solid scientific foundation. While many of his views have since been modified or changed, his main argument remains unshaken, and today evolution is accepted in principle by everyone but the most bigoted theologians. This was his greatest contribution to science, to establish evolution as a general principle, universally at work throughout all nature. His books, The Origin of Species and The Descent of Man, are so well known as merely to necessitate mention. His lesser known books are Animals and Plants Under Domestication, The Expression of Emotion in Men and Animals, The Fertilization of Orchids, The Formation of Vegetable Mold, his Journal of Researches, etc. Useful summaries of Darwin's life and work may be found in several books published in the present series, particularly Fenton's Darwin as a Naturalist, 567, and Darwin and the Theory of Evolution, number 568. Closely associated with Darwin's name is the name of Alfred Russel Wallace, co-founder of the Theory of Evolution. While Darwin may be credited with a certain priority in working out the theory and in supporting it with a mass of incongestible data, Wallace conceived the general idea at practically the same time, and he may be said to be the co-founder of evolution from the theoretical point of view. Wallace was born in 1823 and died only a few years ago. He was a naturalist of originality and distinction, his chief works being the Malay Archipelago, the Geographical Distribution of Animals, The Wonderful Century, Man's Place in the Universe, etc. Wallace was a convinced spiritualist, and his book Miracles in Modern Spiritualism had a wide circulation. His contributions to organic evolution remain of the highest value, however, whatever views one might hold as to his personal beliefs. The great forerunner of Darwin was Lamarck, 1774 to 1829, who may also be said to be, in a certain sense, the originator of the modern theory of evolutionary thought. He led a life of continuous struggle with poverty, and later in life also becoming blind. In spite of this, his industry was extraordinary and his work of the greatest value. In 1778 he published his Flora of France, and later his Philosophie Zoologique. His natural history of invertebrate animals marked an epoch and had an important bearing upon all subsequent thought. During his early years, Lamarck was a botanist, but later on he devoted his energies to zoology. The laws he first proposed on use and disuse, heredity, etc., were of the utmost importance. Herbert Spencer was one of the leading lights of the last century, and his influence was also widely felt. His first principles was followed by the principles of biology, the principles of psychology, the principles of sociology, the data of ethics, etc. He first applied scientific evolutionary thought to the whole of life, thus embracing society and regarding it as an organization. A useful compilation of outstanding sentences from Spencer's works may be found in number 573 of the present series, The Gist of Herbert Spencer. Linnaeus, 1707 to 1778, occupied a unique place in scientific thought. He was a Swede, and for many years occupied the chair of the University of Uppsala. While primarily a botanist, he extended his activities into the fields and collected and classified a vast mass of material. In 1735 he published in System of Nature, and 2 years later an important book upon plants. He also published several other botanical works. His chief work, however, for which he is justly famous, is the System of Non-Nomenclature, which he first proposed and introduced. The division of animals and plants into genus and species was due to him, a method of naming and classifying plants and animals in use today. Next in importance came his introduction of terse formulae for purposes of description, and finally his fixing attention upon species. The latter step rendered possible Darwin's work years later. Coffee pause. Buffon, 1707 to 1788, was one of the most important names before that of Lamarck. He was superintendent of the King's Garden and published some 44 volumes, the most popular of which was his Natural History. While he contributed nothing strikingly original to evolutionary thought, his work was most important in preparing the mind of the public for later developments, in spreading the interest in scientific topics, and in assisting to lay the foundations for what was to follow. It must be understood, of course, that many of the most important lights in evolutionary thought have been mentioned in the section devoted to biology, such as Huxley, Heckl, etc. They were, however, primarily biologists, whose names become intimately associated with the theory of evolution rather than naturalists, such as Wallace and Darwin. For this reason, the classification has been made. Amongst the most influential of the modern naturalists is Professor Henry Fairfield Osborne, of the American Museum of Natural History, New York. His books on The Origin and Evolution of Life, Men of the Old Stone Age, The Age of Mammals, From the Greeks to Darwin, etc., have attracted attention throughout the scientific world and ensured a place for their author in all future evolutionary thought. The writings of Goethe, Kant, Bergson, and other philosophers should also be mentioned as having considerably influenced public thought in favor of the general doctrine of evolution. Kant's influence was more in the field of astronomy, Goethe's in that of biology, and Bergson's in that of psychology. P.D. Ouspensky's daring and original work, Tertium Organum, should perhaps be mentioned here as indicating the possible future evolution of man. We have already mentioned the early work of Culver and von Bauer in the section devoted to biology. Following their work and also that of Linnaeus, Carl von Siebold, 1704 to 1785, introduced 4 classifications. For the simplest on unicellular animals, he adopted the name Protozoa, which they still remain. He also made several further classifications, Anthropodia, Vermes, etc., which are also employed, and which have greatly amplified the question of classification. Meanwhile, the science of fossil life had been making giant strides. Culver may well be regarded as the founder of vertebrate paleontology, and Lamarck as the founder of invertebrate paleontology. William Smith, an English surveyor, had meanwhile observed that the arrangement of fossils within rocks was always the same, and that the relative age of rocks might be determined by an examination of their fossil contents. It was because of this discovery that the past history of the earth became more evident. by reason of the index thereto, which the fossil remains offered. It was in this juncture that Charles Lyell, 1797 to 1875, published his famous Principles of Geology, which so influenced Darwin and and determined the whole trend of his future thought. Lyell laid the foundations for scientific geology. A number of brilliant paleontologists followed up his work, of whom Richard Owen and Louis Agassiz, 1807 to 1873, should be especially mentioned. Later names of note are O.C. Marsh, E.D. Cope, and Joseph Leidy. Carl Zittel, 1839 to 1904, is the most important figure in the history of paleontology. His Handbook of Paleontology, summarizing all available information and offering many valuable and original suggestions for workers in this field. And that is the end of that chapter, and I think that's where we'll stop. We'll see you in the next part.